Hello and welcome back to OT, the podcast, where we're here to talk about watcher's time and how to spend it. I'm Andy Green.
And I'm Felix Schultz.
Count Felix Schultz.
The one and only.
How are you going?
Good. I'm pretty hyped
Why's that?
about this week's guest, actually. Bit of a surprise departure from the usual for us. But
It was a little bit of an odd one, and I was a little bit hesitant kind of going in.
I could tell that. I could sense it in your line of questioning.
And look, I'm a whiskey man. It's basically all I drink. But I didn't think that the listeners would enjoy it. But I tell you what, we had a great chat. It was awesome.
Yeah, and like this sort of came. How did this come to us, Andy? It came to us from just a PR email, and we're like, sure, why not? We'll give it a chat. We did a bit of research, and the more you sort of think about it, there's a lot of similarities between these two sort of niche industries that make for some sort of whiskies at least, pretty high end product and similar sort of approaches to heritage and marketing and all that sort of stuff. So Gordon Dundas is this week's guest. He is from Ian Macleod, which is a distillery group that distills Glengoyne, as well as a range of other whiskies and the odd gin. But we have a
bunch of
chat to
stuff.
him. But before that, Andy, we've been doing some things.
Yes, you've been very busy, as always.
No, I really haven't. I've been busy at work, but I haven't been, doing anything particularly exciting in the what Felix has been up to category of podcast. I've been at home cleaning out the house and writing words about watches.
Sure.
So the only place that I could get inspiration for this little chat is from our Discord, which we forgot to plug last week.
We'll double plug it. What did you find in our Discord that we'll link up in the show notes?
Well, we had a link to an article on tactical clothing, or the rise of tactical clothing from the exceptionally good Gear Patrol, which is sort of a longer read that looks at what the use of, air quotes, tactical as a marketing term and where that came from. Most often related to sort of military clothing and all that jazz, and in outdoor gear and all that peripherals, men's accessories, it's pretty eponymous and sometimes ridiculous. Did you have a chance to look at this?
I did. I read it this morning, actually. I thought, because a couple of people were saying, it's a great read, really interesting, fascinating, and I thought, I better read this, and then it turned out to be 6,000 word article, and from Gear Patrol especially interesting because they're all about the gear, and it was sort of, some may say a bit risky to publish that.
I think a bit thoughtful, really.
Very thoughtful.
You've got to, and as the person who sort of posted it in our Discord, which you can join up at through links in show notes and through our Instagram, pointed out this does have relevancy to watches. Like a lot of watches talk about the the tactical finishings and straps and this, that, and the other made for special forces,
military collaborations with special forces teams, military collaborations, or historically important stuff.
So very much worth a read, and I think you'll probably appreciate that if you've anywhere into the space. I mean, maybe you'll think again about, or think a bit more critically. Don't have to think again. You can still buy that big sort of military tool watch, but maybe think about how it's being sold to you. Speaking of, I've got a dilemma, Andy.
What's that?
I'm going on a trip.
You are?
At the end of this week, and I'm going to take a watch. Probably going to take the Grand Seiko.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Do you reckon I can put it on a Artem Strap?
Where are you going?
Going up to the Sunshine Coast.
So it's going to be a bit warmer than chilly Melbourne?
Yeah.
What are you doing?
Well, I'm hanging out with Seiko, so I figure, wearing the Grand Seiko is what I've got to do, but I've got a problem. So the Grand Seiko I've got, it's a very sort of silver champagne dial, pretty formal as far as they go. 20 mil lugs. I've worn it on NATOs before. What do you think I should pop it on a NATO, on a sailcloth?
Well, what are you doing? What are you doing up there? Let's strap to the occasion.
I don't know.
You don't know what the agenda is? So Sunshine Coast, beaches, potentially some water sports.
Yeah. Maybe I might go, I don't know, diving with some whale fish.
Pack an Artem NATO.
Sure.
They're pretty classy. They do the nice sort of seatbelt finish to them.
Yeah.
take a strap tool and maybe have a sailcloth strap up your sleeve in case you want to kind of swap it out.
Shit. Proper.
Why not?
Well, and that's one of this is, Andy, you don't need me to tell you what I'm about to say. This is where drilled lugs come in handy.
Oh, it's going to be an absolute breeze. And if you want to visualize the straps we're talking about, head to artemstraps.com or check out their Instagram, artem.straps.
We've been supporting the show for a while now, Andy.
Yeah, all year long.
Yep.
So thank you,
Black
Artem
NATO,
Straps.
I think that's it. Black NATO, silver dial. That's a combination I can roll with.
It's hard to go wrong. Take the sailcloth just in case.
Sure, gotcha. Hey, have you been up to anything exciting?
Yes, I've been watching What We Do in the Shadows, the TV series. Yeah. There's 4 seasons now. Thoroughly enjoying the Kiwi humour. Taki Wakiti's finest, I think. It's just so stupid and so detailed. And so
it's really, really good.
It's top tier.
Have you watched any of it before?
Yeah. I don't think I've seen season 3 or 4. So
sure, right.
Come back into whatever subscription service it's on and saw that it was there. I did enjoy this because we obviously talked about a flagman's death.
Yep.
Probably Wellington Paranormal early on in the show.
Yes.
Just silliness, just absolute silliness. So anyone who wants to have a good chuckle, do that. What We Do in the Shadows. Concept-wise, well, it's a show about, I guess, old school modern day vampires living in, where are they, Brooklyn or New Jersey or something?
Staten Island
with Pete Davidson. I'm surprised he's not made it onto the show, to be honest. But
the thing I like about it, like with any good sort of satire, though, is that it comes from a real place of love, and they're very much punching up with all the sort of the stereotypes and the tropes. It's such a good concept, and it keeps. I think it's better than the movie.
Yes, oh, definitely.
And I every so often I see articles about it being the best show, like the best comedy, at least sort of sitcom on TV, which is wild to think of, but I can't think of any others that are like this. Is for me Brooklyn Nine-Nine in the early years level of enjoyment. Yes,
yeah, it's up there. It's really give it a shot, guys. Speaking of shots, Brad Pitt in Bullet Train. Have you seen the trailer for this?
It looks pretty stupid in the best way possible.
It kind of looks like it's going to be a good film. I'm pretty keen to see it. I think Brad Pitt is, I can't remember what his character's name is, Ladybug or something stupid like that.
No, his name's it's something even. He's on it's something.
No, he's
train,
Ladybug.
It's something.
Ladybug's his code name.
Right.
And it's assassins and whatever. I think he's got to do some sort of smash and grab and transport like $10 million. But he's obviously a Breitling ambassador, friend ambassador.
He's an ambassador. He's a big shiny top tier ambassador.
Yes. Well, he's wearing a big shiny platinum Breitling. One of the reeditions, the 1953 Avis 765.
Is this what you wear when you're an undercover assassin?
Yeah, what do you think of that? What do you think? I mean, could have just done steel. Why did they do the platinum? It was their shot, and they took it, and they thought, let's put one of our most expensive models out there. What do you think of this move by Breitling?
Is it a tax deduction for someone?
No, I mean, it's marketing, and it's probably part of his contract, right?
I mean, he doesn't, from what I've seen in the trailer, he doesn't appear to be a particularly low-key style assassin, so maybe it works.
I mean, it's not a super high-key watch. Like, it is a vintage, inspired wrist shoe, so it's got creamy patina, black dial. You'd think that it was...
How can you tell it's platinum? Is it a special dial configuration?
Yeah, it's a special dial configuration.
Sure.
So the platinum has a blue dial, which is what he's sporting, apparently. So it's pretty, I mean, it'll just be shiny, and maybe his wrist is a little bit heavier. If anything, it's going to slow down some of those punches and stabs.
Do you know what I think about this?
What do you think about it?
We've got to stop watch spotting inorganic watch placements.
Yeah, 100%. We've just played into their hand, haven't we?
We've
done exactly what they wanted us to do.
The marketing works, Andy. Edit this out. Breitling, you're not getting this free advertising.
Yeah, well, moving on then. Felix, we are a professional podcast. There's probably some sort of disclaimer about being of legal drinking age if you want to listen and you want to continue on to hear us talk about whiskey with
alcohol.
We are talking about alcohol, so if there's anyone who's not of legal drinking age, please stop listening right now and come back next week. But we should
be talking about guns and gambling.
But really interesting chat with Gordon Dundas. I mean, just to reiterate, it's a bit of an education lesson on, even how whiskey's made, what the process is, why it's special, what those, those dates on the labels mean. Like, it's a pretty cool chat. He's a really good guy. He's interesting. He's got his own podcast, so he knows how to tell a yarn.
More than I expected to talk about the economics of whiskey.
You told him at the start, oh yeah, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, see how we go. And then I think we had to cut it off at 50 minutes because
It's just that
dinner
good.
was ready. So what a guy. Let's get Gordo on.
Gordo. Today's guest is something a little bit different for us. Mr. Gordon Dundas is a veteran of the whiskey scene with 17 years' experience and background in whiskey media before he started working with distillers. He's also the host of a much tastier podcast than ours, Whiskey Unscripted, and he has been the international brand ambassador for Ian Macleod Distillers since 2017. Welcome to OT, Gordon. How are you?
I am very well. How are you, gentlemen?
Yeah, we're fantastic, man. It's great to have you here.
Great to be here. Great to be on. I'm looking forward to having a chat.
We normally start off with an icebreaker question. What's going on? And as I was writing these notes earlier, I'm like, ice or neat?
Very good. Exactly. There are no rules with whiskey. Drink it the way you want to drink it. And I think one of the best examples of this was I once went out with 5 or 6 other ambassadors, and we all drank the same whiskey, and we all drank it in 4 different ways. Some with ice, some with water, some with a mixer. There you go. So there
Nice.
are no rules.
How do you take it, Gordon?
It varies. I lived in Taiwan for a while, very hot.
Mm-hmm.
I liked whiskey with ice. Consequently, in Scotland, when it's January, really cold, I like it straight. So it totally is all about how you're feeling. It's a very adaptable drink. So, just really all those sort of old rules of don't add water to single malt, got to drink it straight. Absolute rubbish. Drink it the way you want to drink it.
Yeah, I think in all things in life, anyone with really strict rules is probably best avoided. Um, but so, as someone whose day to day job and I assume life's passion is advocating for and promoting whiskey, what are the biggest sort of challenges and misconceptions that you come across aside from people with old fashioned whiskey rules?
I think the other common misconception, although it's definitely changing because the audience and the consumer is changing and the awareness is changing, is that it's a drink for the older gentleman. And that is absolutely not the case. If we look at the worldwide whiskey, uh, consumer now, the biggest growing category is women between 20 and 35. Which is fabulous. We're also looking now at a very different sort of uh, uh, people getting into whiskey through cocktails in the on trade and through serves in the on trade, as well as food and things like that. So there's plenty of different ways that is actually saying whiskey is one of the now the most sort of widely appreciated products in the world, certainly in the world of spirits. And what I love about it is obviously it's one of the most naturally produced spirits in the world. So you have a really strong really strong provenance with whiskey, which a lot of other products don't, and that really relates to the modern consumer now. And so we're seeing whiskey growing across all touch points, from bars through to buying it in an online or off trade or whatever, through to high end in certain countries. So it really is an exciting category, and it's really it's got more to do, but it's really not what I said at the beginning. It's a drink for everybody.
I love to hear it. One of the brands you work with is Glengoyne, which is
Glengoyne.
Glengoyne, Glengoyne, which is quite proud of the fact that they're really efficient at making whiskey. Why is that?
Well, I mean, our tagline is unhurried since 1833. So we've been in our little valley, the valley of the Goyne, Glengoyne, which means Valley of the Wild Geese,
Oh,
uh, since since 1833 legally. Uh, and I think the point is that if we look at the style of Glengoyne, if you visit Glengoyne, and I'm sure a lot of people have that maybe are listening. It's amazing how many people have. Um, it's a small distillery. It doesn't make a lot of whiskey or spirit, but it's made in a really inefficient way because we're all about delivering flavor. And that comes through a very unique production process in terms of how we distill and things like that, which means that it's done very slowly, which helps us build flavor through the production process. And then when we put it into those wonderful casks, which give all the wonderful color that you see in whiskey, um, we over time produce a 10, a 12, up to a 50-year-old whiskey. So time is inextricably linked to uh, and our lack of sort of appreciation of it in a way, if you know what I mean, is linked to Glengoyne all the way through the process, and that's why Glengoyne, I think, when you taste it, everybody really tastes something a little bit different in single malt, which is great. So yeah, it's a small but perfectly formed whiskey.
That's really interesting. And you sort of pinched the question I had. We were going to ask about how important time is in making whiskey, which is, you talk about whiskey, we talk about watches. It's a pretty obvious connection to make. But I want to, can you break down what time tastes like?
Yeah, I mean, like, yeah, I mean, so if you go to a whiskey distillery, the spirit that you make, the clear liquid that each single malt distillery and everyone in Scotland makes a slightly different style. That's the history. That's all down to the history of Scotch. So you have some that are peated and smoky, which are generally on the outside of Scotland, because
Mm.
that's where they have the access to peat to dry their barley. And then you have a whole wonderful array of different spirits produced at other distilleries around Scotland, which is why I think Scotch whisky has such diversity, is down to the history of it and the diversity of the spirits produced at each distillery. However, I think what's really important is when you understand how you mature whiskey, it takes time. And so when you walk around a supermarket in the UK, for example, where you can buy spirits and
Mm.
whiskey. Um, not the same in Australia so much, but you can it's the only product in that whole supermarket that takes 10 years or 12 years to make. It's not toothpaste or whatever. It's a very unique product, and so when you understand that putting whiskey into a cask and it sits in a warehouse in somewhere in Scotland for 10 years, at least 10 years, we get a little bit blasé about, oh, it's only a 10-year-old. And I'm like, 10 years. It's a long time. It's a really huge amount of time. And when you taste something that's been in a cask for 10 years and you drink it and you enjoy it, almost sit back and think, wow, it's 2022. What was I doing in, 2012, 2011, And then that just multiplies out to when you produce something that's 25 years or something that's 50 years. We released a 50-year-old about a year and a half ago, 50 years. So that's sort of 1970 it went into a cask. 1970. I mean, it's been
Mm.
sitting in a wooden cask for that amount of time. And when you really understand that and just get the magnitude of that, a little bit, it really hits home how important time is. Um, and that's what I love about this product, is that you can produce a huge diversity of different styles of whiskey by appreciating that time, and particularly in Scotland because of the weather, it takes longer. If you go to somewhere like if you go to somewhere like Kentucky, you can produce whiskey quicker because it's hotter. But is it better? Well, it's different. That's the point. It's not better. It's different. And I've got a friend of mine who works in India
Mm.
for a whiskey company, and they get so much color and flavor so quickly because of the temperatures and things like that, that time is a different thing for them. Whereas in Scotland, because of the way we mature and the temperatures and things like that, time really takes a long time, and that's the beauty of whiskey.
Yeah, and we were sort of talking offline a second ago about the similarities between fine watches and whiskey, and you're kind of
Mm,
touching on it now about, geography, and, for watches, definitely there's sort of strengths in
mm.
different countries within the world, Japan versus Switzerland, obviously, famously. And I guess Scotland's the Switzerland of whiskey to an extent. But how important is the actual geography of where the distillery is, where the whiskey's made, to sort of flavour? Maybe even somewhere like Japan versus Scotland versus India.
Well, if you look at firstly the temperature is the first thing to look at, and so if you go if let's look at India is maybe one extreme, and India they can mature whiskey in 2 or 3 years because they get so much heat, and they get a lot of color and they get big bold flavors, and because they get a lot of interaction in the cask because of the temperature. And they've produced award-winning whiskies, and but they're different. They're not Scotches. They're different to Scotches, although they're single malt. They're not made in Scotland, and their environment is very different. Far less the temperatures. If we go to Scotland, you look at, for example, a distillery like Glengoyne, which is more inland, a little bit greener. Um, and then you have a distillery, for example, maybe on Islay, which is a little bit more on the west coast, more open to the Atlantic, slightly different temperatures and things like that, slightly different environment. The way I look at it is, if you were to park a car, let's go for a car that's something like an Alfa Romeo, right? I don't know why an Alfa Romeo. There's a joke, they tend to rust a bit. Okay, so let's let's put an Alfa Romeo, park it at Glengoyne Distillery outside the warehouse, and leave it for 10 years. And let's park a car outside the warehouse on Islay and leave it for 10 years. When you go back to those cars 10 years later, probably the one at Glengoyne will be covered in green and moss and stuff like that, and the one on Islay will be covered probably more with rusty and salty and all that type of thing, because of the environment that it has. And there is no doubt that when a whiskey is sitting in a cask for 10 years, it takes on a bit of that environment a little bit. And so that does have an impact, I think, on whiskey. And so there's a whole load of things to consider in terms of what gives a whiskey its style. The spirit, of course, the casks, but there is also an element of a little bit of where you're maturing it over a long period of time. Obviously it takes on a little bit of that, because over time you lose whiskey out the cask to the angels. We call that the angels share, and air gets in that cask. Air, that's what happens, and you get oxidation, and the air is obviously the air of the surrounding area. So all these things come together to give the alchemy of making whiskey, something we don't fully understand yet. Genuinely, we still don't get it 100%, which is sort of great, really.
Yeah, it's not 100% a science yet. It's
No,
it's
no,
still a
it's
little
not
magic in
100%
there.
of science. Absolutely not. And I quite like that,
Yeah,
actually.
I mean that is cool, and I suspect there's maybe not too many sort of traditional industries in the world that still have that alchemy in them. And
Hmm.
we were doing our sort of prep, before this, and initially, we don't know, how interested you are in watches. So we're like, oh, how can we talk about watches and whiskey together?
Oh, I love a watch.
We'll get to that in a sec. But the more that we were sort of thinking about it, is there is really, really striking similarities even in the broader macro trends. Like you've already sort of talked about, how the homeland of whiskey is Scotland, like the homeland of fine watches is Switzerland, but that's been changing. And in watches, since the 70s, Japan started, coming, of age, and now we're seeing a time when there's world class watches being made everywhere. Is that trend happening in whiskey and spirits as well?
Simply, yes. Scotland, I think, always has. Scotland has history and has diversity of whiskey like no other country. And it is almost the sort of original, almost along with the Irish. The Irish actually producing whiskey probably before the Scots, but through history, Scotland's become more dominant and more diverse. But if you look at Australia,
Mm.
20 years ago, there really wasn't much going on in Australian whiskey. Now, Australian whiskey there's some amazing whiskies coming out of Australia. Tasmania
Mm.
used to have, I think probably about 10 years ago, used to have about 8 distilleries. There's now a huge amount of distilleries on Tasmania, like lots and lots of them. And around Australia, there's a huge amount. And I think a lot of that interest in Australian whiskey has sparked a really step change in Australia, I think, in terms of whiskey more generally. And we see now in the market Australian consumers seeking out more diverse whiskies from Scotland and around the world, as well as obviously consuming and enjoying Australian whiskies. Uh, Probably one of the best examples, though, of a sort of there is a new world in whiskey, undoubtedly, and there's whiskey distilleries, you know, everywhere now. I mean, genuinely everywhere. But if we look at Japan, I used to work for Suntory, and in Japan, they've been making whiskey for nearly 100 years now. So they're not quite as new world as some of the other places. However, one of the great stories about Japan is the gentleman came over, a gentleman called Matsutaka Taketsuru came over to Scotland back in the early 1900s and learned how to make whiskey by going round distilleries in Scotland, and then went back and basically paired up with Shinjo Tori of Suntory at that point, and they produced their first whiskey, which was a complete and utter disaster because it was it wasn't the Japanese palate wasn't ready for it. So they split off, and Matsutaka Taketsuru went and created a company worked with a company called Nika, and they produced a Japanese whiskey. And from that point onwards, Suntory and Nika have been producing Japanese whiskies, and they have basically having taken the knowledge from Scotland, but making whiskies which are a bit more aligned to the Japanese palate. And that's where we see the sort of adaptability of whiskey to the consumers or to the environment that you're trying to sell it in, as it were. And so um, it's an amazing industry, and the worldwide appreciation for it is growing and huge. And I mean, let's even think about countries like India. India is the biggest whiskey consuming market in the world. They drink molasses whiskey, um, but not whiskey as we know it, but hugely, aware of the whiskey market. And China as well. These two markets are not fully developed yet, so there's a huge demand out there for whiskey. So we will, yeah, it's an interesting sort of sector at the moment for sure.
I love the history lessons. So for someone who isn't into whiskey but is curious, where would you recommend they start? What would you recommend they try? And what should they be looking out for?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't drink anything other than Glengoyne. No, I'm joking.
If you were.
No, I think, look, you need one of the best things to do is if you've got a friend who drinks whiskey, that's always a good thing. The other one is if just go to a specialist retailer. Don't necessarily buy whiskey on price. Go to a specialist retailer and say to them, look, I'm a little bit new to this, but I really want to try it. And sometimes they have things for you to try, or so, generally, and it's absolutely not a rule, but I would probably go for something, and something like Glengoyne, something like that is a bit, Glengoyne is a little bit of a lighter whiskey to maybe try initially, but that doesn't mean anything. I gave somebody once their first whiskey ever was a heavily peated whiskey, and they're now a huge heavily peated whiskey fan. So they'd never had it before. So um, listen to people. There's a lot online as well, but also there's whiskey shows that you can go to, which are a really good educational thing on whiskey. Great bars will help. So go and seek out people that know. Guessing is not necessarily the best thing to do, but the best thing, rather than spending a lot of money on a bottle of whiskey, is to maybe try a few. And how you can do that is maybe through some friends, or through a show, or through a retailer or something like that.
That's great. I think that's advice with all things in life, not just necessarily whiskey. Go to the specialists. Go to people that are passionate about it.
Absolutely.
And Andy, as we've been talking, my mind flicks back to the American Chase Falsher, a founder of a brand called Oak & Oscar, who makes watches. But I think secretly he wants to be making bourbon.
Yeah.
He's very, 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 very passionate about that. And We had him on our show a little while ago, and I think we had to sort of pull him back on the booze talk and get him back onto watches. You were talking before that you sort of were a late bloomer when it came to watches. Is that something that interests you, or do you see a connection between the two in your sort of clients or people you meet along the way?
I think that, yeah, I mean, I didn't wear a watch really for many, many years. And then literally I got a bonus one year and went and bought a nice watch. And I don't know I don't know why I suddenly did that, but now I don't know. It just happened. And now I've got a few watches that I would consider nice watches. But um, it's, yeah, there's no doubt. I mean, look, if you go to somewhere like China or Asia, for example, drinking a 30-year-old Scotch it's very different. There's a perception out there that you're doing very well. There's a perception that it's, you have that on your table in a in a nightclub or whatever, and an array of mixers, because that's what happens. Then you know you have a perception of that, that you're doing well in life. And for in many parts of the world, watches are the same. And we all love a good watch. I love a good watch because of the way it looks and the way it makes me feel. But whiskey is similar to that. And so when you're sitting in these nightclubs in China, which I have done for obviously not recently, you're sitting there and you're drinking your 30-year-old. I would have it probably straight at that point, and
Mm.
you're watching the friends of the person whose bottle it is put Coke and things in it. You're like, it's up to them. Internally you're like, but it's like all things in life. It's like, if you took off the strap of a watch and put on a bright yellow one because that's what you want to do, then that, it's just the way life is. And so there is a whiskey has this real prestige. I mean, unbelievable amount now of prestige in certain countries in terms of your status and things like that. And the other thing we've got to notice now with whiskey is that there is a very, very strong secondary market
Mm.
in whiskies, as there probably is in watches. And if you buy, a lot of people are buying whiskies now to effectively make money. And investment in bottles of whiskey is a huge factor now that it wasn't probably so much even 10 years ago. So whiskey
What's your
is sitting in a really unique place. There are challenges, but ultimately there's not enough whiskey at the moment, older whiskey, to supply all the people that want it.
Well, it's good to know, and it's interesting you talk about the investment side of things. A little while ago, we had someone from the team at Night, Frank, who came on and talked about the kind of growth of rare whiskey as an asset class, and you've sort of touched on it. But I'm curious for your kind of take on this as someone who's obviously so enthusiastic about it. I mean, I've got, to speak to my personal experience for a second, I've got bottles, given to me or I bought 4 or 5 years ago, especially of the Japanese whiskey that is now, 4 times what I paid or what it's worth. And it sits on the shelf, and I don't really know what to do with it because I can't be bothered selling it. But I also, don't know that I'm the kind of guy who's going to crack open a $4,000 bottle of whiskey anytime soon.
Yeah. It's amazing what you do when you come back from the pub one night. But no, look, I mean, I get inundated with questions about whiskey now, and it's like everything. It's like watches. It's people. I've got friends of mine who are like, I want to buy whiskey casks, and I want to buy bottles of whiskey and all this, and I'm like, it's like everything. You need to do your research if you're really wanting to do it, and need to you need to be aware of the market. Same with watches, I guess. You've got to buy the right one. You've got to, if you're really looking to do it. It's getting harder and harder because everybody's trying to do it now. So whiskey is, unfortunately, people will get burnt. And the one area that I would always recommend people really consider their thinking is, if you're going to buy a cask of whiskey, a cask is different because you're buying the whole cask.
Mhm.
Um, And one of the reasons I get probably asked a lot of people, people who work in banks and people who work in investments send me a message going, "Should I buy this cask?" And I'm like, why are you treating this like like an investment that why are you treating this like it's different to anything else? It's exactly the same. And there are now a lot of companies jumped on this bandwagon to say buy a cask and you're going to make ridiculous returns over the next amount of years, and you're not. Simply, you are not. And seriously think about it before you do it. Because if you're going to buy a cask of whiskey, one of the reasons to do it is to have at the end of it 200 odd bottles of whiskey that you want to use as a gift or whatever, or
Mm.
person or drink. Don't go into it as you're going to be able to retire having bought a cask of whiskey, because that's not going to happen. So a few things to consider, but certainly there's a lot of people now who've got whiskey sitting in attics and sitting in cupboards that they never knew, that probably have a lot more value than they ever have done. How long that will be the case, I don't know. Will it burst? Probably not. Whiskey's a good long-term banker, but it's a very different sort of very different field now than it was 10 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking. I'm imagining your sort of DMs about getting the hot whiskies are very similar to Andy fielding questions about how they can get a a Rolex Daytona at retail or whatever it is, at the sort of the watch equivalent. And you're sort of alluding to the future of that speculation, which is a question that we talk about a lot, and I don't think anyone really knows the answer. And the industry is struggling, the watch industry rather, is struggling with those issues of supply and demand.
Mm. So is the
How?
whiskey industry.
Yeah, I was going to ask how is the whiskey industry dealing with it?
We're struggling. And the cost of older whiskies. So if you look at the price of you know 20-plus-year-old whiskies, they've gone up a lot, and that's down not just to that, but down to the market conditions, down to the lack of supply. And whiskey's really, really, if you think about how you make whiskey, if you open a distillery, you have to wait. You have to spend all the money at the front end building the distillery, buying all the barley, employing all the people, making the whiskey or the spirit, maturing it for at least 3 years before you can even think about recouping any of it, which is why you see so many gins around, because people are
Mm.
making gin in the short term, obviously, and selling casks to people once they fill them, which is fine because you're doing it from the distillery direct. But the nature of it is it's very money heavy at the front end if you're starting a distillery. And add into the fact now that the power is 3 times more expensive than it was, the casks are twice as expensive as it was, and all the supply chains really difficult. It's a really difficult environment. So I have to say I'm a little bit fearful for some startups in the next couple of years. But
Mm.
aside from that, if we look at something like Glengoyne, which is not a big distillery. We only produce 50,000 cases a year. The biggest distillery from a single malt perspective is Glenfiddich at about 1.3 million. So, we're under 5% of them. If you think about how whiskey's made, you fill a whole load of casks and you keep filling casks, and obviously we've been doing this for a long period of time, so it's a bit like a conveyor belt. And I have this conveyor belt of casks which are maturing all the time, and some of them are getting older, and you have to decide which ones you're going to pull off to make your 10-year-old, which ones you're going to pull off and keep to make your 18-year-old, which ones you're going to keep to 21 and 25, and all this type of thing. And so, if you sell far too much younger whiskey, in the end, you're ultimately in 15 years' time going to affect your 25-year-old, because you've sold too much 10-year-old 15
God,
years before.
yeah.
So there is this ever-ending sort of appreciation of what you need to try and sell. And one of the things that we have to try and do is forecast, because it's so essential in whiskey. And the challenge at the moment in Scotland is that we've all had a relatively good lockdown, in terms of people have been drinking whiskey in lockdown.
Mm.
And we're now in a situation that a lot of a lot of distilleries have not really got enough whiskey. Glengoyne's a small distillery anyway. We're on allocation globally. So we basically say to, for example, in Australia, here's the amount of cases you can get, go and sell them. You can't get any more because we don't
Mm.
have it. And so, it's just the nature of the beast. But in whiskey, because you can't make more, you can make a prestige. I don't know enough about watchmaking, but if you want to make an expensive watch, I know there's a supply issue and they're made really slowly, but you can make an expensive watch.
Mm.
The problem with whiskey is you're thinking about 30 years ago. If we want a bottle of 30-year-old whiskey now, we're at the mercy of what was done in 30
Mm.
years ago when we didn't own the distillery. So that's the challenge consistently with whiskey, is the stocks and the supply and the availability of casks to produce whiskey. Uh,
Fascinating.
and it's just the nature of the beast, because it's when something takes 30 years to make and the rules say it's got to be in a cask for 30 years, you know, we're at the mercy now in 2022 of what went on in 1992. And so when you think of it like that, and watches I know are a little bit different, but nothing has that longevity. That
Yeah.
means that, you know, well, that is why the price of that is because that's what happened back then, and we've matured it all this time, and we've lost probably 50% of it to the angels over that period.
Mm.
All of these things come into making aged whiskey what it is today, which is more expensive than it has been. I have to say, I don't see it changing in the next, 2 to 5 years.
It sounds like it's going to get worse.
Or more
Uh,
expensive.
the supply is going to get the supply of older whiskey is going to get more challenging. Simple economics would suggest that supply and demand, what the next thing is, but um, we'll see. And
Yeah.
look, we want to keep it accessible, but add in all the factors we've spoken about, and I don't see it changing. And 30-year-old whiskies, as I said, if you look at if you look at a 30-year-old whiskey, you may pay $2,000 for it, which is quite a lot of money. Absolutely, it's quite a lot of money. But it's not something you're gonna. It's like a good watch. Sometimes you don't wear it every day. You wear it every. You don't drink this whiskey every day. You have it for special occasions, and we all want a bit of that. So there's a whole load of things. There's a whole load of synergies, of course, between
Mm.
whiskey and watches.
Another one, and this is a parallel that I'd be interested to get your take on, and especially as there's more and more money sort of floating around the market, and especially the secondary market, is the issue of either outright fake or misrepresented whiskey, which is something that happens a lot in watches, especially in the auction market. And I know also I've watched a few fascinating documentaries about fake red wines. Is
Mm.
it what's happening in the Scotch space?
Look, yeah, there is fakery. Absolutely, there is fakery, um, and a particular country particularly good at it. But yes, there is that, and there's a lot of people. A lot of people wanting. There's a big trade in empty bottles and
Yeah,
boxes and things like that, which
labels.
is should just be stopped. But yeah, there is that. We're very lucky to have the SWA, which is the governing body that works very hard to protect the legality of Scotch, and so they lay down the rules of how your label looks, how even the basic rules of how you mature whiskey, and it's got to be 3 years, and it's got to be made in Scotland, and all this type of thing. And they do a very good job around the world, making sure that we clamp down on the fakery aspect of whiskey. But it is a problem. It will continue to be a problem. And again, I can only warn people to be hugely aware of it. If something seems too good to be true, it probably is.
Sage advice. In watches, there are 6 brands, 6 or 7 brands that really dominate most of the conversations. Rolex, your Patek, etc. Is
Mhm.
it, and as well as big groups that sort of have 10 or 12
Mm.
different brands within them. Is the landscape similar in whiskey?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be amiss for me to not mention Macallan, which is probably the brand in whiskey which has driven prestige unlike any other.
Mm.
And they are now I think they swim in a bit of a different space to most other whiskies. And they produce about 1 million cases a year, so they're smaller than Glenfiddich, but by value, much, 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 much bigger. So they have amazing stocks of whiskey and older stocks, and they have this worldwide view of what whiskey is for them and what the consumer is, which is ultimately luxury, and more luxury than whiskey.
Yeah.
So Macallan has driven a huge uh, sort of prestige whiskey like no other brand. And there are now, what you're seeing is there are now other smaller niche brands which have, through different principles, got a huge following. So, and I'm talking purely in a secondary market. If you look at a brand like Springbank is from Campbelltown. It's not from a glamorous part of Scotland at all, particularly. Makes wonderful whiskey, wonderful people, and you can't get it anywhere. And it's just great whiskey. It's not beautifully packaged, particularly. It's what's in the bottle is what's driving the demand, and it is fantastic, fantastic whiskey made by great people. Um, and so that's sort of a very hot product at the moment. They sell everything they make, and so there's two sort of reasons why those. I mean, they're brands that you would never link together in terms of their percent or prestige, if you know what I mean. But they are brands that are in huge demand for maybe two different reasons. But if you look at Glengoyne, or you look at one or two other whiskies, we have huge demand for our products. We sell everything we make, and from a secondary perspective, they do very well. We also have a brand called Rosebank, which is a closed whiskey distillery. It closed in 1993. We have all the remaining stocks of this whiskey,
Mm.
and we're rebuilding it. So we're rebuilding the distillery on the same site, and it'll be open in 6 months. But as I just said to you, of course, we've then got to employ the people, make the spirit, buy the casks, and we're not going to see a new Rosebank for probably 8 years. So we have all these older whiskies which are in huge demand because there's only a finite amount of them, and when they're gone, they're gone. And we'll be releasing a new one in the next couple of months. um, that's driving a slightly different agenda because it is a finite resource from a closed distillery. And so people are looking for the lack of quantity is the big issue. And people are wanting something that is from one of the most iconic whiskies and one of the most iconic distilleries that was closed in, basically 30 years ago. So it's there's a huge dynamic to each one. I guess you would see the same in watches, but ultimately, what makes a whiskey, in the secondary market or in demand is down to a whole load of things, and it can be image, it can be the quality, or it can be the lack of supply. And it's all three of those things feed into the narrative for the buyer.
Yeah, that strikes a lot of parallels, and I suspect marketing budgets play a not insignificant
Of
role as
course.
well. Gordon, it's been really great to chat to you, and our tradition at the end of the podcast is to ask you for a recommendation about something you've been enjoying. But with you, I sort of want to ask you for two.
Okay.
One, I want to ask you for a resource or something that people can do aside from visiting their local bottle shop to learn more about whiskey.
Or listening to your podcast.
Yeah, obviously, listening to Whiskey Unscripted, you will learn everything you ever needed to know about whiskey. Joking aside, um, uh, there is a very good resource. It doesn't actually exist anymore. Oh, it does online, but I think it's the best resource for whiskey. And it was called scotchwhiskey.com, without an E, just Scotch Whiskey. And it was run by a company called it was the Whisky Exchange in London, which is a big, very big retailer and sort of distributor of whiskies around the world. And they created this resource about 5 years ago, and it was brilliant and fabulous. Had the best writers, had the best sort of comments and the best articles, and it has all the information on every distillery. But it's all been left online, so you can find it. So I would recommend typing in scotchwhiskey.com and having a look if you want to find out about a particular distillery, or Glengoyne. It will tell you all about Glengoyne, obviously our website as well. But as a sort of central resource, I would suggest that that's a really good place to see tasting notes, understand a bit about how whiskey's made. But there's a lot online, and I would certainly probably start there. For me, it's a great resource.
Love it. And the second part of the question is there like a representation either on in a movie or a TV series or even a book or something that you think captures what Scotch is all about?
Oh, that's a tough one.
Even a scene
Look,
like that one of what's one in Tokyo with Bill Murray that was used
yeah,
a lot?
Lost in
That's
Translation.
the one. Yeah, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean that's a great film, and I do love that film. And then I think Scotch is, if you look at Scotch, is probably roles in TV has changed, and it's gone from maybe a sort of swigging out the bottle type thing in certain things to, well, you remember in James Bond, he was drinking a Macallan in one of his recent films. So I think it mirrors a little bit about how Scotch has changed its. I think it has transformed itself, and it has become now a really strong. Um, what's the word? Just a really a strong sort of character almost
Mm.
in itself. And so I'm just trying to think of that. I'm trying to think of something which I would see. Oh, I can't think. It's for me though. But the great thing is that Scotch, I think, is becoming a drink for everybody, and you're seeing that now even in books and on TV.
Love it.
And there's a program here. Can't remember the name of it, but she's a detective and she drinks Scotch whiskey. So I'm like, fantastic.
You'll
Hopefully not on
remember
the
it.
job.
Yeah, he's not on the job. No.
Well,
You'll remember it as soon as you
I will. I
and you
will.
can send it. You can flick us an email and we'll pop it in the notes. If not,
I will.
yeah.
But no, I'm so. It's such a wonderful industry to work in. I work for a family business, which makes it even more compelling. We are a rare family business. There's a lot of Scotch companies are, Diageo is the biggest company in the world, drinks company in the world. They own like 38 Scotch whisky distilleries. So there's about 135 in Scotland, and probably only 25 of them are independently family owned, maybe a bit more than that now. But working for an independent family business is a really great dynamic as well. And we're really focused on all the things we've spoken about, but ultimately making great whiskey. And I think when you drink a Glengoyne, you'll see that, and it is available in Australia.
I was just going to say, where can I find a bottle?
Right. You can get Glengoyne in Dan Murphy's, but you can
Okay.
also pick it up in some of your specialist retailers
Nick's
and
maybe or
online.
So we want to go 25-year-old or 21-year-old or
Well, I mean, if you want to have so Glengoyne in its slightly older ages, we use a lot of sherry casks.
okay. Ooh.
These come from Spain. They are beautifully created casks to make brilliant whiskey.
Mhm.
And when you taste the 18, 21, 25, you see the influence of these sherry casks and probably make you think about when you're going to drink whiskey. So 10-year-old's a great whiskey just to drink and enjoy. You don't have to, it's full of flavor, but you don't, you just drink it and enjoy it any time really. But the 18, 21, 25, probably a bit more of that after dinner style. The 25, thick, rich, very thick whiskey, very intense, brilliant, absolutely brilliant. But it's like one glass of it, and you're like, that's just immense,
It's
fabulous
living.
stuff. So, exactly, and I'm a great believer that you want to have a whiskey that suits what you're doing. So if you're after dinner celebrating, Glengoyne 21 or 25 is perfect. If you're out and about, walking up a mountainside beside the sea, maybe you want a peated whiskey. Maybe you want something that's a little bit more maritime, and so, there's the array of Scotch makes it such a great category for people to explore. And you will explore it, and you will go down rabbit holes, and you'll come up the other side and go, I'm so glad I did that.
Well, that's really great to chat to you, Gordon. And Andy, I think we need to break out the card and place an order with our nearest.
It's a work expense now.
Yeah, it's a work expense.
Tax deduction.
Yeah. Gordon, really, really great to chat to you. Thank you so much for
No.
making the time. And yeah, we really appreciate having you on.
No, it's been great, and I think I just want to make I was in Australia not that long ago, and we were out doing some great stuff with Swift and Moore, who are importers over there, and we do a lot of work with them, and they've been really good in terms of getting our whiskies out there to the on trade and key places, and it's great to have been out back into the market, and the appreciation of whiskey out there now is just. It's almost like no other market. It really is fantastic, and it was great to be there. It was great, and I just thank you very much, guys. It's been brilliant.
You, Andy. I don't know about you, but I feel like a refreshing beverage right about now.
Thirsty.
Yeah, thirsty works. The old podcasting. Thank you so much, Gordon. Thank you so much, Ian Macleod for making Gordon available to us. And thank you, Artem Straps, as always, for making a superlative, not so tactical product.
You'll have to post pictures from your trip. Let the people know.
If you want to get in touch with us, there are two main ways you can do it. You can email us, ot.podcast@gmail.com, or you can hit us up on Instagram, ot.podcast on Instagram. Andy, how else can people support the old show?
Of course, join our Discord. Make sure you're telling your families, friends, your tactical friends, your whiskey friends, all about the show. Leave 5-star reviews.
Call of Duty Squad.
Yeah. Twitch stream it. Let us know. But yeah, we'll see you guys next week.
Bye.